Good afternoon and welcome to BizTech's Asian Midday Market Watch, powered by Austral Asset Management. We have Vishnu Varathan, Head of Economics and Strategy from Mizuho Bank, as our guest today, the 27th of February. Good afternoon, Vishnu.
Good afternoon, Brian. Thanks for having me. It's always good to be joining you on a Monday.
Now, Vishnu, for a start, what's top of mind for you as we start the week?
So I think it's going to be inherited from last week. What we saw last week were markets getting rather concerned that the Fed may turn out to be more hawkish, and to be fair to the Fed, as they have suggested, rather than as markets have defiantly predicted,
And
because
also,
of
that's what the numbers are telling them to do.
absolutely, like, and you are on the money because the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, that's the PCE data. So that's just consumption inflation as based on GDP, and the core PC numbers as well as the headline accelerated uh, rather than decelerating, as was the expectation. And so this really knocked markets off their chair. You can see Friday, the dollar ended much higher, equities were lower. So US equities are bleeding for the week. US Treasury yields are a lot higher. So all these are pricing in that the Fed could hike a lot more than they said earlier. I think right now markets are expecting another 75 to 100 basis points. There's still a little bit of disagreement on whether they would cut late in this year, but that's really beside the point because markets are getting more worried about the Fed lifting rates, and in parallel we also saw geopolitics stepping up in terms of intensity. Russia Ukraine was in focus. There's some framing of China's complicity here, where that led to some China risks manifesting. A weaker renminbi also means weaker Asian currency. So this week there may be a continuation or at least a reinforcement of the theme whereby a strong dollar may dominate. Asian currencies may be feeling the heat and may be on the back foot. Risk assets may not do very well, so equities may be softer against a backdrop of higher yields, because one other consideration is if the US has got to suffer with a surprise rebound in inflation, it may be a global theme. So the rest of us may need to be worried about it as well.
And we've also talked about in previous show the divergence in policy among central bankers now. You have the likes of Australia and New Zealand, which is basically hiking up rates. But you've got Malaysia and Korea, for example, which have called a pause on rate hikes for now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can differentiate that even further, where I think Malaysia and Korea have taken a more tentative stance. I think Bank Indonesia has pushed it further to suggest that they can pause from here on, and I think that's where it turns premature, because even if domestic inflation for one reason or other remains contained, validating the central bank's view. Unfortunately, central banks cannot ignore what the Fed is doing, because that has got some implication on currency stability and capital flow stability. And markets
Exactly,
are not.
Vishnu. So for the likes of Korea and Malaysia as an example, and Indonesia, as you just pointed out, if the Fed does what markets expect and does a 75 basis to a 100 basis point hike, you're going to have a significant outflow of capital towards the US and currencies, and by default, strengthening the US dollar.
I mean, yes. I mean, at least uh, for the time being and heading into the middle of the year, the dollar could retain a lot more of its dominance, and that comes at a cost, as you rightly pointed out, to some kind of a home bias, where capital has a bias to go back to the US, and that leaves EM major currencies licking wounds, being softer, and this is where I think the policy reactions could get a bit more fraught or hairy. So those are risks that we are particularly looking out for. The risk on the sideline is that if US China tensions mount, then those risks that we just described get amplified. So that's something also worth keeping our eyes on.
Now, looking ahead for as we start this week, what are some key other data points or events that we should be looking out for this week that could move markets?
But for the G3 in the US, I think we've exhausted most of the tier one data. So whatever is coming out probably is not going to overturn the kind of sentiments we saw. In Asia, you'll get some GDP numbers. India, Australia, you get some early CPI numbers, Vietnam here and there. But no matter how we look at it, I think it doesn't distract from the fact that any resilience in Q4 GDP data will probably be brushed off as backward looking. So any currency strength that you see from there, markets may be quick to fade it. And inflation data as well. I think markets may not give it the benefit of the doubt and be fearful of the Fed rather than getting any relief out of inflation step down in Asia.
Now, Vishnu, as always, thank you very much for your insights. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Brian. It's my pleasure.
Now, we've been speaking to Vishnu Varathan, Head of Economics and Strategy at Mizuho Bank on BizTech's Asian Midday Market Watch, powered by Austral Asset Management. I'm Brian Fernandez. This video will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our social media platforms. It'll also be on our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.